What's going on, people? We'll begin in a moment.
I teach in the Department of Literatures and English, and we're so excited that you're here for our first panel, our first live in-person panel in 2 years, which is really exciting for us. We had a great short at Buffalo Street Books last night, where all 7 authors read or performed their work. Went great audience, and we're so excited to continue on with events. If you didn't get a schedule card, which is one of these little cute ones with writers' faces and schedule of events in the back, come and grab one afterwards. Our panel right now is Narrating the Past and Rewriting the Future. And it is moderated by our student festival director, Amulya, who is amazing, as you will see, and is going to take us through a fabulous panel. So thanks again for being here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for calling me amazing. That was good. Yes, we're here today for the Narrating the Past and Rewriting the Future panel with Alexandra Kleeman, Jenn Shapland, Oyler, who's joining us from Berlin, and Liza Birkenmeier. All of these authors' works exist in different periods of time, but they all connect because they capture different moments of existence from the past and the present, and we want to see how that interacts with the future. So as we get into today's discussion, the first question that I have is for all of you, actually. The stories that we write today become tomorrow's history. They shape themes of literature and social standards. So my question for you is, do writers have a responsibility to address the future in their works? And maybe Alexandra, you could start it off, but I would love to hear from everyone.
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, I'm not the type to dictate things to writers at large. I don't think any writer has a responsibility to address the future, but I think that we are all addressing the future in one way or another. In terms of, for example, when we address history, we show either a conformist version of history that upholds our ideas about how we've progressed since then, or we show some other ways of living that maybe were extinguished in the time in between, some possibilities that we no longer think are possible. In my book, I thought of it as a pre-apocalyptic novel because I grew up reading a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction. It's a thing that I feel naturally drawn to, but I also feel very wary of the ideas it puts forth about what kind of futures we can possibly have, you know. There's something dangerous, I think, in the idea of projecting versions of the same future over and over again. It's sort of like a buccaneer, individualistic, Wild West fantasy that takes place in many different iterations. And it reinforces the idea, I think, that the future that we're headed towards is one where we will need to think of ourselves and our close-knit tribes first. I think there's another future out there that would be more collective and would better reflect the principles that we'd like to see today too. And to tell that story is a crucial part of widening the future and showing that there are different outcomes and different possibilities, not just this one thing that we're heading towards. So in that way, I think that we need more people writing different futures, not just the technocratic, super slick future where things are solved, but futures where people relate to each other and work together in ways that it seems sometimes like they're kept from doing now.
Thank you so much. I would love to hear from everyone.
Yeah, I'll answer. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, writing a memoir is particularly weird on this question because I was always navigating writing about a person from the past who I was encountering in my present. And then the fact of writing is that any person who reads what I write is in the future compared to me writing it, right? But at the same time, while I'm writing the book, which like took a period of, 6 years from when I started researching it, I eventually find myself in the future from the narrator who is telling the story. And so like a big decision, I think, when you're doing any kind of personal writing like that, and I'm sure this is also true in fiction, also true in every genre in its own way, but I had to figure out where am I going to leave myself in this book? And like where am I going to position the narrator, even though I've kind of already lived beyond this time. So there's kind of this wrestling with time that happens when you're trying to narrate from your own life while you're living it. The other thing I thought about quite a bit was the concept of legacy, and how a historical figure or an author's legacy is constructed. Because one of the things I was up against with the book was a number of like already existing texts and stories, narratives and myths about Carson McCullers, about her time period, about what her sexuality was like and what other people's sexualities were like at that time. And there was a very strong bent in the way that legacy was constructed for future readers, so that when they encountered Carson McCullers' work, they didn't necessarily have a clear sense of who she was, which was interesting to me in the process of researching and writing the book, because what I learned from her own writing, from her therapy tapes, and from her letters was that she was a lot more out as a queer woman in her lifetime than she was when I encountered her on the page in the 2012, 2013 era. So basically, one of the things I was thinking a lot about was how important it is to kind of reconfigure or undo some of these erasures or address them, which specifically means give language to it, right? Like give language to the things that haven't really been spoken clearly, even if they weren't like totally left out of her biographies. They were elided or euphemized. I don't actually know if that's a word, but I use it a lot. Euphemized. And to give those language so that in the future, when writers encounter her work, suddenly like all of these other words will surround her, and this other story about her that's more, in my view, more accurate to the way that she lived, but less accurate to the view of those who were trying to construct her legacy after she died.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I feel like everything that you write down is necessarily a letter to the future. I don't know how responsible you are. I love the question of feeling that responsibility. And I feel like the way that I can most reflect on it is actually in my reading more than in my writing, which I so appreciate in both fiction and nonfiction writing. The ability of a writer to make a subjective history of something, which I think is always going to be truer than whatever we call a subjective take on anything that we've ever learned about. So I feel like one of my greatest joys just as a reader and writer is experiencing a moment through an unapologetically subjective gaze. And there's a little more satisfying, so I hope I'm accidentally doing that when I write about things. I hope I'm accidentally breaking people's hearts in the future when they feel nostalgia for a place they've never been.
No, I love that. The unapologetically subjective gaze. Yeah. Lauren, we would love to hear from you too.
Sure. I think this is an interesting question and one that was fascinating to me while I was writing my book, which is a lot about technology. And I think our relationship to technology is often futuristic, even though you're holding it in your hand, but the way that it moves so quickly, it makes it feel that it's constantly everything is constantly becoming obsolete. And this is sort of a challenge or an anxiety a lot of writers feel about depicting technology, less so now, but I think when I wrote Fake Accounts, there was a lot of conversation about how you couldn't write about social media because it moved too fast, it was too ephemeral, like it was too stupid, things like that. And the way that I tried to solve that problem was by just being super specific. And I think in general, if one feels a responsibility to one's readers who are, as everyone sort of noted, necessarily in the future, it's to depict things very clearly and honestly and not try to kind of construct, sort of build a legacy for yourself, or be sort of, speak as if you are superior to the passing of time, which we all have to experience. And I was also thinking a lot about the idea of depressions with respect to this conversation, and something that Jenn just said was very interesting to me, which is that, people construct all these myths around Carson and McCullers, and they have ideas about the past, and then they project those ideas onto histories or stories or whatever. And actually, the past is often much more similar to the present than we allow for. And I think it's really important not to sort of succumb to this presentist view of thinking that our time is so unique, we're so special, everything is unprecedented, everything is dramatic. It just feels that way to us because we've never been alive before. But yes, it's a very interesting question. Thanks.
Thank you. I actually have a question for you, because Fake Accounts takes place very much in the present. Unlike the other novels here, which take inspiration from the past, Fake Accounts can be considered an archive itself, documenting life in the present. So I was wondering for you, how do you think writing in the present influences the future?
Well, I mean, I don't think that, I try to believe that as a writer, I have as little influence as possible on anything. And I think that that's probably the case, but it helps, I guess it can help illuminate the past, right? So my book is set in the first 6 months of 2017, and even if it feels very contemporary, right? I tried to think of it as, when I was writing it, I tried to think of it as if I were archiving something or recording something, so that when things inevitably become, references inevitably become dated, like technology becomes obsolete, the way that I was describing it, right, would make it make sense to somebody who was reading it in the future, or somebody who's reading it now who doesn't have a relationship to any of the technologies or events that I was talking about, right? And I think that there is a kind of historical role a novelist can play sometimes. I don't want to press too hard on that point, but certainly when you read Henry James, or you read Middlemarch, or you read Jane Austen or something, you inevitably learn things about the time in which the novels are taking place, the novels were written. And I don't think that we as writers in 2022, or it's 2022, writers in this year are exempt from that principle.
Thank you so much. But yeah, all the authors that we have here, all of you write in very different genres. So I was wondering how the genre of your story affects the process of narrating history, like we just heard from Lauren. So with such vastly different genres, we have a climate novelist and we have a playwright. So does it bring up the question of whose story is being written and whose future is being shaped? Yes, this is for everyone.
Well, I think my answer to that also has a little to do with what Laura just talked about how our present is also, it's a narrative artifact, and it's also something that will become a record of our time, and it's intervening in the perception of the futurity or the pasturity, that's not a word, of our time. In that way, I think I really struggled with the idea of writing a near future novel. Near future is a funny concept because it's got a more magnetic relationship to the present, I think. It unfolds the present more in its discussion of consequences and outcomes, and it implies that this is where we're going next, which of course is narrative construction too. But I thought a lot about building a bridge between telling a story about a world that seems recognizably ours, and then how the elements that are new would sort of make their presence known within it. So I decided I was only going to tweak a couple things, but one of the biggest things was a form of synthetic water that people in the sort of Southern California region were drinking because their own water supplies were defunct. So I did a lot of thinking about where the consequences of that invention would outflow and how it would be sort of metabolized by a culture that is still ours, where we get habituated to buying certain things, where we have no spare mental energy to think about what it means that I'm buying this at the grocery store. You just need to buy it and you need to go home and take care of your next task. So the sort of rapid normalizing effect that our lives have on us, I think, would even apply to something as seemingly like futuristic as this product water. So I trailed that out and showed some different effects. People are, say, getting tanks installed in their basements that can allow that water to be pumped through their system as though like they were just turning the faucet and normal water was coming out. What really freaked me out though is I cast my near future into something that I thought was based on what I saw around me, but was also supposed to be an imaginary. For example, when I was a kid and I lived in LA, I would see small wildfires burning off the side of the highway, and they always seemed magical and beautiful and very sort of scary to me that this was happening so close to Fry's Electronics or the Food Lion or whatever. And I was like, I'm going to exaggerate that. I'm going to have wildfires burning out in the hills, and it's going to be a big thing. But by the time I was editing my novel, I was doing it in Colorado, somewhere deep into the pandemic, and 3 of the largest wildfires in Colorado history were burning around me. Meanwhile, in Mendocino County, they had run out of water and were trucking it in from the next county. So I felt like near future is not, it's not such an option in a moment where things are changing very quickly and where an outcome that we've decided to think is futuristic is actually much closer, even if it's only sporadically and in local ways than we think.
Thank you so much. I love what you said about the idea of near future.
Should I go?
Oh, of
Yeah,
course.
great.
Yes.
I can't. It doesn't matter. Well, I think I sort of circumvented the problem that Alex was just talking about by writing about the recent past, or at the time with present, then beginning the recent past. And I think the genre or the style of writing or the form that I was working in, which is sort of auto-fictional in a way, helped keep the narrative grounded in that time period, because it could necessarily only be like one person's experience, and that person is sort of me and sort of not me. And so it was quite easy to not easy, but a sort of very contained way to conceive of the novel and sort of help push it through, I think. And in general, I feel that the novel is so expansive and like accommodating as a form that you could approach your setting, your time period in a number of ways, and they could work because it's so forgiving in this way. It would be quite hard to write a speculative memoir. I mean, I'm sure someone's done it. Someone please tell me if there's a speculative memoir. But it would be much more difficult if you had to be truthful.
Yeah, genre is fun to talk about in this way because I feel like I can avoid, any sort of meaning with like these technical elements that I'm working with when I'm writing the past, where I don't have to capture it with the sort of linguistic acuity that any of you might for your past and future work, or near past, near future. I'm, dealing with how people are speaking and the objects that they're holding and the things that they're witnessing in such a literal way. And so hopefully that I can like decorate that planet with enough accuracy and imagination to make the past feel right here. I like in terms of genre of writing a play that is largely no, though not thoroughly naturalistic. I have these sort of this choice to build our recent past, though it is a past that I wasn't. Maybe Jenn, you have this experience too, but I'm writing about a time largely that I did not experience. I was not alive for, and so the sort of convergence of my research versus my imagination, I have the tools of only people's dialogue and the things that they're saying and holding to work with, and hope that I can communicate not so much anything about the past as a feeling that we get to be inside of it in a hopefully imaginative lens.
Yeah, I like thinking about this in terms of genre, and I haven't really thought about that too much before, but I feel very lucky to have written my book at this time. Like, I don't think in previous eras it would have been published. Like, I just don't, I don't think it would have made sense, but like we happen to live in a time when nonfiction has really exploded in a lot of different directions. So, I mean, there are like older books that I looked to and like reflected on when I was writing this, like Audre Lorde's Zami, which she calls biomythography. That was really like super interesting and informative to me, where she chronicles both her own life, but also sort of the history of a community. But then like more recent, almost hybrid nonfiction writers, often writers who are both poets and nonfiction writers, really spoke to me. So Claudia Rankin and Layli Long Soldier's books were like with me as I was writing this, but also Nathalie Leger's books, particularly Sweet for Barbara Loden. So like there are a lot of books actually that combine biography and memoir in the way that I do, or in a way that I find similar. Although I feel like a lot of people who read my books say that they've never read something that did that before. And I'm like, no, there are a lot of these. I did not come up with this idea at all. But previously, I feel like biographies, and many biographies still do, take a very objective stance on the person that's being written about, and they erase kind of anyone's personal investment, the author's personal investment in that story. Whereas I'm much more interested in the interplay of those things. In the place where you could say maybe it does become a speculative memoir, because I didn't know Carson McCullers, and I didn't know any of her friends, and I didn't talk to anyone who knew her intentionally while writing the book, because I wanted to get closer to my own projection of her, my own idea of her. I don't know. I don't really know exactly why I did that. But I think that the books we write are totally shaped by the genre conventions of the moment that we live in, and we just happen to live in like a very juicy time for nonfiction.
Yeah, on the topic of genre, actually, I have a question for you, Jenn, and you already touched on this, because my autobiography of Carson McCullers does like blur lines between memoir and biography. But I was wondering about how the process of the research is for you. Does it get easier for you to live in the archive that you created, or does it become difficult to separate what belongs in history versus what belongs in the present?
That's a good question. In the process of writing my autobiography of Carson McCullers, like I definitely started out thinking that I was writing about someone else. So I started out in the archive with the letters that I wrote about yesterday in the reading, like what are these love letters? Who were these women? Need to know everything about them. And then I was, because I was an intern at the archive, I ended up cataloging the personal effects of a number of different writers, one of whom was Carson McCullers. So suddenly I'm like handling her clothes and like measuring them and photographing them and like housing them in tissue and like checking for like different stains or rips or markings. And suddenly I'm like, okay, this is not the way I'm used to dealing with a historic figure or an author I admire. It's like, it's an intimacy that's very unsettling, and archives produce that unsettling intimacy, which is, I think, why I like them. And so as I kept, I thought I was just going to describe these objects I encountered. That's sort of what was happening organically while I was working in the archive. I was just writing about like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's socks, and like Gertrude Stein's, like all of her stuff smelled like poodle, and I thought that was really funny that they even still smell the dog. So I was just kind of writing these little like notes to myself as I worked, because like I said yesterday, I was not a very good archivist, and I still not. That's technically my job. But again, I thought I was just describing objects belonging to someone else. But the more of these I collected, the more I began to see that the person who was seeing the objects and perceiving them and smelling them was also in the frame. Like I wanted to somehow be able to show in the frame not just what I was seeing, but the person who was doing the seeing and the impact that was having on me. So it was like slowly over the course of the research, I became more and more entangled with it. And then my story came to be more and more a part of the book as it went along, even though that was just not really my intention.
Thank you. I think that also, it gives us a nice segue to the next question, because because I was thinking about the role that yourself would play in the research of this. And all of your works deal with identity and time, but none of them distort history, but all of you attempt to pull out something that was hidden in the history. So I was I was wondering, how does writing history create that visibility? And does it leave room for you to insert yourself in there? Maybe Liza could start us off with this, but this is again for everyone.
Yeah, I love this question because I think that I get fascinated with topics like between the Cold War and nuclear weaponry in history, and feel no room for myself in those topics, and I'm interested in making room, and not necessarily because I wish to have experienced the Cold War or anything like that, but I just feel with so much of the history that most fascinates me, it feels so evident how limited the perspective on that history is, and what we're actually learning when we're taught what that history is. And so I don't know that I write about times that I feel like personally excluded from as any sort of way to change anybody or influence even what we think about that time. But I find it to be like a particular challenge and a really fun, fantastical activity to look at a moment that excites me and see what else is going on. It's its own fantasy world building, actually. And I think in Dr. Wright, in this play that is about Sally Wright and the night that she's getting ready to leave on the STS-7 mission, the play, while framed around her, is not about her. It's about people who will never have the opportunities that she has in many ways, and that she is Sally Ride gets to break the limits on how we think of a physicist and an astronaut, and also never comes out in her lifetime. And that whole world in such a beautiful and heartbreaking way, to me, makes me feel about how our social constraints are so much deeper than even our physical ones, which is like such a difficult thing to wrap a mind around. And I find it to feel really fantastical and magical to live inside such a heartbreaking moment, and to explore it for all of its hopelessness in a world where people like love each other and are having fun.
Anyone?
That gave me so much to think about that I've kind of forgotten the question. Can you ask it again?
Yeah, no, I'll repeat the question. I was asking about how does writing history create visibility, and does it leave room to insert yourself into history?
Well, in the case of Carson McCullers' life, and specifically the angle I was taking on it, I was frustrated because I could see myself in those letters I found. I could see myself in the relationships that were portrayed in the letters, but also in the therapy transcripts and some of the other materials I came across. And I could see specifically relationships that I'd had with women reflected. And I could also see like a lostness and an inarticulateness around her identity and sexuality, particularly in the conversations with her therapist, that I hadn't seen expressed anywhere else, but that I had experienced with my own identity. So there was, something in the past that I identified strongly with. And then when I read anything about her, all of that was erased. All of that was elided or kind of just glossed over or diminished, made to seem not important. Like, oh, this relationship with this woman, Anne Marie, she was just like obsessed with her. She had this crush on her. It wasn't real. And I'm like, you didn't read these letters. This was real, and it was a mess, but it was it definitely happened. So it was like very much a process of like, and this is kind of like the last answer I gave, where like I became more and more part of the story, because as I came across these absences and erasures in the archive and in the written work about Carson McCullers, I felt like I needed to somehow make visible the parts that resonated with me because I thought they could resonate with other people. And Carson McCullers' work has a long history of resonating, especially with queer readers. And a lot of queer readers are very aware of her queer life, even though you have to really read between the lines to find it. So it was like I just wanted to make that more visible and more explicit. And the best way that I found to do that was by including my own story, was by saying like, okay, so here are the records we have, here are the letters we have, like this is like, you know, this is how this relates to my own search for identity, my own search for language around my identity. This is how this relates to bad relationships that I have had, you know, but inserting myself into history, right? Like in that way was, I feel like how I was able to make it visible. It's a really good question. I'm glad I asked you to repeat it.
Thank you for the answers. The answers make the question better. But yeah.
Yeah, and you know, I really like this question too, because one of my concerns writing a novel really is, even though it's like a longer form, how little it holds of what's there, I think. When you are describing a setting, a place, like how much are you leaving out? Like this is a concern I have with climate change in novels that are written in the supposed present. Like, is it there? Does any character think about it? Like, or is this an alternate world where that isn't a part of the fabric of physical reality? But for me, like it really came up when I was writing about Los Angeles, because I think one of the main feelings I have when going around Los Angeles is you can see like some traces of history. You can see like a lot of things like oddly, eerily, and cheerily intact from the 60s or 50s, but time seems to have started then, you know, and yet the landscape and the indigenous peoples there have such a history that isn't tremendously visible when you look around. So in some ways, like I was very conscious of writing a bubble novel, you know, taking place in this artificial bubble of Hollywood with these people who feel like the world ends where the limits of their privilege end or something like that. But I wanted to poke holes through that sometimes. So there's parts where the cameras wander away from the the narrator, the narrative eye wanders away from the car that the characters are in and starts traveling through neighborhoods where they are solving the water problem in a different way. For me, like the place where I wrote history in this book is like a pivotal scene where our two protagonists go to confront the corrupt producers of this movie with their role in the whole plot. It doesn't go well. They're not really interested in participating in this takedown. And so they just sit around depressed. And then one of them turns to the other and says, hey, why don't you tell the story of how your family got this land that we're on right now? And it's sort of like a party story. It's a thing that you can tell she's told before, but it's told in this cheery tone, but it's actually like a horrific land grab story that she ends with like and that's how my grandfather got his land with the help of some friendly goats. The tone and like the meaning like diverged so sharply there, and I knew I couldn't really fold too much history into this book because it already felt like so overloaded, like a fruitcake just full of fruit. I had such a hard time managing it, but I wanted to show like there is like a whole past to this place that no one in the book is really capable of seeing or is not interested in looking at too long, but it's there. So history's presence by absence, giving a piece and showing how much is unknown still.
Thank you. I'm going to frame history's presence by absence and put that on my bedroom wall. Lauren, would you like to add to this?
Sure. I just was thinking that this is a sort of problem that one of the problems that I was trying to dramatize with fake accounts, right? Which takes place where the narrator is a blogger, so she's on the internet all day, and she sort of has to like perform knowledge of history and also sort of be able to predict the future in a kind of knowing ironic, kind of cynical way as part of her job, and she also obviously starts doing this in her life as well. And it creates this, it makes her very alienated because, and everyone around her also very alienated because they all feel as if, even if they don't know everything, they could know everything. So they could know sort of like everything about history that there's possible to know. And with that knowledge, the knowledge makes them sort of feel totally irrelevant and pointless, right? And there were all these conversations when I was writing at the time about, you know, what stories were necessary, what stories were urgent, what stories like needed to be told, right? So I was interested in this sort of superfluous woman or superfluous person whose story like definitely doesn't need to be told, but she still has to exist. And I think it's not really about. It's sort of like getting away from. I don't know if it's about visibility or if it's about sort of like bringing out just alternate elements or sort of complementary elements to the main sort of narrative of the present and the past or the recent past. But yeah, I would say that this is a question that the narrator of my novel struggles with for the entire thing.
Thank you so much. I loved all of those answers. And we have time for one last question before we can ask for audience questions. I wanted to play with the double meaning of the word climate, because this came up for me as we were reading Something New Under the Sun, and then again when we read Dr. Wright, because in class we were trying to think about how the word climate works as a reference to the natural environment, but can also refer to the social era of the time. So my question for Alexandra and Liza would be, when you're writing a climate novel, when in the process does the climate become essential to the literature part of the novel?
That's a great question. I mean, people always include the climate in fiction, but usually it's sort of like the Bart's reality effect thing, given the exact temperature or whatever of a moment, just to assure you that there is a reality out there, you know? I think sometimes we gesture toward the weather or toward the outside world just to assure people that this is happening in a real place. I think the moment when we begin to notice the outside world as something that belongs in the foreground is when it starts doing something that interrupts our plans, that derails or makes it difficult to do what would otherwise be easy to do. Like, and I think that I use this metaphor a lot when I was writing the background coming into the foreground. In good times, the background stays safely in the background, but in the bad times, you can't drive to your next destination to run an errand because the road is closed, because there is a fire on both sides of the highway, for example. So I think it's just an entangled world that it adds a lot to the top heaviness of the book. Like to build in this friction with the environment that seems unrelated to the plot, like it makes it so you have more to deal with. And also I'm always afraid the readers when you go, yeah, what happened to that plot I was following? Like, why are we stopped here? But I think that it's important too. It's part of the setting. It's part of the setting of that near future time, and it's increasingly part of the setting of our time. So I don't think everyone should build the world in a particular way, but to be conscious of where you're letting the climate sink into the background and become inner, and where you're letting it hold back so the humans can be foregrounded. I think it's always something to note, and to note that it's happening because it does fit the shape of what we sort of hunger for and listen for in the story. But I think it reinforces this real like anthropocentric view, and really the way that we tell stories can be a way of getting past that too, I think.
Thank you. And yeah, for Liza, with a completely different definition of the word climate, the play is very defined by its 80s setting, right? And the climate of the 80s was very different for exploring sexuality than it is today. So because the play also revolves on such a historical moment, I was wondering about what the context of that moment is that is so important and can't be replicated in another moment in history.
Yeah, I love this as like put against the literal climate of Alexandra's work, where it's like in this sort of natural sensory deprivation of being a reader or writer, how nice it is to have this figurative climate to write about, to give us sensorial input in this way that we can understand like heat or temperature, whether literal or figurative, whether we are talking about near future or near past. I think that the sort of the strange specificity of setting this play on a really particular night in 1983, like the specificity of it is also what makes the climate of it feel to me so expansive that I think we can, like I could include myself or include my community in such a tight focus because they were dealing with things in a way that meant that they were sort of physically stuck. They're physically stuck. We can see that because we have the privilege of staring back at them from the future. We have the privilege of knowing what happens and how things turn out. Like we are in an immensely privileged perspective when we look back at 1983. And I find it exciting to have that gaze. And I don't know if that really answers your question, but I'm really excited about thinking in your question about the sort of the sensory nature of how the literal climate affects the figurative and vice versa. Yeah.
Thank you. That definitely does answer the question. And we talked a lot about the gazes in class as well. But we do have some time for audience questions, maybe 1 or 2 questions.
For Jenn, I really wanted to ask you, well, I guess you touched and reflected on it during the panel, but when it came to approaching the life of another person and trying to understand their passions, her motivations, and what drove her character and her life, how were you able to place yourself in that space?
Well, what was really important to me, especially when I started writing, because I was so frustrated with the way Carson and McCullers had been written about, was to find everything I could that she'd written in the first person. And so that's really why this became like such an archival journey and why the letters were so important to me, and then the therapy transcripts. So there was just something to me about, I guess because at that time I was in such like a formative moment where it seemed to me, it was also so a formative moment in my personal life, but then also in my work life, I was having such a strong like visceral reaction to academic writing and to the imperative to leave the personal out of it. While at the same time working at this archive where every day I saw scholars come in to look at materials and manuscripts and books because they cared really deeply in a really personal way. And so that like disjunct was really kind of in front of my mind. And so I was really looking for like, what would Carson McCullers' story be if she were telling it? And it was like very early on in that process I was describing of just like writing down these little kind of notes to myself in the archive where I was like, I should write an autobiography of Carson McCullers. Like that's what I said to myself. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense. And then I just hung on to that for the next 6 years. In part because one of the things I learned was that she tried to write her autobiography twice. And the first time she tried to write it using these therapy sessions, right? Like that she had recorded and then transcribed, and she imagined that that would be the first draft of her autobiography. And like, to me, it doesn't really get more first person, doesn't get more personal than therapy. I've found in my research since I've been doing some research on other like mid-century women that a lot of them had their therapy recorded and transcribed, which, like, can you imagine? Like, why would you want that preserved why would you ever want to revisit that? Why would you want anyone to see that? But like, as a record, it's just like, there's nothing like it, right? Like, there's nothing that's more a person wrestling with like finding the language to tell their own story. So for me, like a question I often get is like, did you feel like you were invading her privacy, or did you feel like you were like transgressing some boundary by reading these transcripts or by telling these stories? And like my answer to that is that, well, she wanted to publish this, like this is a draft. She was trying to turn this into a book, and she was also playing her therapy tapes for anyone who would listen, which just tells you a lot about like who she was and like, what she wanted the world to know about her, which was everything. She was such an open book. And then at the same time, like in terms of queer history, especially the word privacy is often invoked as a way to silence narratives, to say like, that's private, let's not talk about that part of that person's life. And that's how we end up with these like very obviously queer historical figures who are never like taught as such, or who are never understood as such by readers, because of the way those like private stories get left out.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
That was so insightful.
Good question.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's what I was thinking about. What are the boundaries of telling someone else's story in your writing, and how do you go to that place to think through the person's thoughts? And,
Yeah. I'll say one more thing, which is just that, like, if you were writing about someone else and they specifically said to you, don't share this,
exactly.
right? Like, there's a clear boundary that like you should totally respect, but like it does get murkier when the person's not alive, and it gets more complicated, the stakes are different, and it's totally, I think, a case-by-case thing, but it's like a really big question in nonfiction, especially. Somehow in fiction, when you're fictionalizing a life, like you can kind of talk about whatever you want. But when it's nonfiction, like there is that pressure to respect, or to understand like kind of where your perspective ends and theirs begins. So totally a really murky, fishy, fun question.
Thank you for the question. And that brings us to the end of the panel. Thank you, everyone. Big thank you to all of our authors for being here. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us from Berlin.
Amulya, do you want to shout out the rest
Yes.
of the events?
Yes. We have another panel today at 2:30 with more amazing authors and moderated by Abby, our assistant to director. We also have a reading today at 6:30 in the same lounge. And we also have a creative performance by Ioana Marganiti. She's our art director, and that's at 5:30 in Wayland. So please join us for those. Yes. And there's more scheduled events on these cards that we will be passing out. We have another final day tomorrow, and we hope to see you there.
Great. So great. Thank you so much. Amulya, such a good question. Yeah.
I know, it's so good, I know. I know. Thank you so much.